All right, so welcome. My name is Matt Sitter, CEO of AFN. AFN was designed with the idea that change is where opportunity happens, and the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. We bring subject matter experts to help increase the diversity of our knowledge with people who have gone deep on particular topics and be able to leverage what they know to help us drive forward in what we're trying to accomplish. Who we've got here today, we've got Steve Kahle with us. He's a long-term entrepreneur with deep tech and operating experience. He's a productivity expert. We're going to talk a lot about how we actually use our time in the best way possible. Welcome, Steve. Really good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Matt.
So maybe just going first to the thing that we talked about just right before everyone else was getting on around deep work. The book by Cal Newport. So when you're thinking about how we use time effectively and that idea of deep work, how do you think that drives into philosophically how you consider organizing our time?
Yeah, I think everyone on the call is going to know that deep thinking work cycles are really important to bring in that high value work. And so how can we make sure that as leaders, we're allocating time on our calendar? Because I think something that we're playing kind of like with water polo, we're talking about that and offense and defense and using our calendar defensively to make sure that we are using time on our calendar. We know, for example, for some and many, based on our chronotype, that, towards the morning is when we're going to really have our best cognitive hours. And maybe for some, it's going to be maybe a Thursday block of time or a Friday block of time, getting that on the calendar and then protecting that time so that we're not pushing that to other items that may be perhaps more urgent, but could be potentially delegated. So the first thing is realizing, one, we need to make sure that we're getting that, deep thinking work cycle time on our calendar. And then we're also protecting that time so we can, deliver that high value work.
So just as we're thinking about that deep thinking time, just a couple of tactical things around it. How long do you think we have to have? What are some of the aspects of the deep thinking that makes this something that we want to actually achieve?
Yeah, so we have circadian rhythms that go 24 hours, and then we know that now we have ultradian rhythms, for example, that we sleep in typically 90-minute segments. And there's been research that shows that, we're best to kind of operate when we're cognitively fresh in 90-minute segments. So if I'm going to be doing a block of time that's going to be cognitively demanding, maybe it's going to be strategic time, or I'm creating a new resource that I will typically block that time. And it's going to be in the morning and using more 90-minute segments. It could be shorter. In the afternoon, I may have, if I'm doing some similar type work, typically I may go to a Pomodoro approach where you're typically going for about 25 minutes, breaking for 5, and then doing another 25-minute work sprint, breaking for 5, doing it about 3 times and then breaking for longer. But I think overall the idea is making sure that we're being concise, having breaks in between, typically in the morning hours for me. I can go 90 minutes straight through, but definitely afternoon, I'm not going to, I wouldn't typically, block a 90, minute work sprint, at 2:30, for example.
Okay, good deal. And, when I think about how we spend our time and attention, I believe are two most scarce resources that we've got. It's really tough to make more of those things. Thinking about just the amount that you can accomplish in that deep work phase, compare that to how you might work in other ways where you're actually, getting interrupted or things like that.
Yeah, you're talking about the rise of Superman and Stephen Kotler's work, and also the Genome Project as well, and how we can as leaders get into a flow state. And so ideally, what's happening, back to playing defense on our calendar, is we're protecting that those deep thinking work cycles, and our team knows that that is time that is sacred, that we want to make sure that we can go deep. And so ideally we're building in a work culture that respects the time on our calendar. So before someone interrupts, they're going to look at the calendar first. Like I used to always challenge teams that I don't have an open door policy. I have an open calendar policy. So you can certainly look at my calendar, and if you want to, book me on your, son's Saturday soccer game, I'll be there. But the idea of having respect for people's time, because this idea of, you mentioned attention, that, our ability to focus and concentrate, like Gloria Mark has done some research, and we're basically switching our attention about every 59 seconds. And so hard to do deep thinking, work cycle work whenever you're being interrupted continually by external forces. And then we also have to make sure that internally that we're really giving the time and energy to staying focused and avoiding distracting ourselves and getting pulled into something that's not going to be centered on the work that we're doing.
Right. Well, and so, leaders within an organization, I would say they're particularly susceptible to being distracted in some way. You're trying to actually drive forward on what you're trying to accomplish with an organization. You're supposed to be accessible to the people that are around you. Why do you think that we index so far on this distractibility as opposed to being able to block our time out?
Yeah, I think this idea of asynchronous first mindset is really gaining some traction, and it should. I think always on, a lot of times we're kind of buying into this sort of hustle culture, always being on, which is highly destructive with our ability to deliver. Now, there's times as leaders when there's an emergency and we need to be all hands on deck, and certainly times to interrupt. Let's say, for example, if Matt, you and I are collaborating, and I need something from you, but it's not urgent. Taking an asynchronous channel, like perhaps we're using Teams or we're using Slack or we're using Twist or different tools, we can, use asynchronous tools in a smart way that's not going to pull you out. Kind of like, going into a, Las Vegas casino. That's sort of like work or knowledge work today, that there's all these lights and ding, 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 and everything taking our attention away. So I think leaders are recognizing today that they're asking the question, as the chief cultural leader of this organization, how am I architecting a culture that's allowing my team to have more of this deep work time? Like Cal Newport in his book talks about, these deep work cycles are really the high value time that a knowledge worker can bring to the organization. And it seems like by default, most organizations are designed to where we're fragmenting that time. It's sort of like attention confetti, and not allowing our team to focus because we've removed, all friction and make it very easy to interrupt. So I think there's also a lot of how can we start to build in rhythms and processes and knowledge in our culture that respects these deep thinking work cycles.
I like that you brought up Teams, because I would say that not everyone feels that it is asynchronous around what they're doing. I would say, some people are like, oh, it feels totally synchronous because something's buzzing at me whenever I get a new message there, or that it's demanding my attention in some way. And so thinking about how you're placing rules on top of that, it's convenient technology to be able to communicate. But it sounds like you're advocating somewhat that it's not just these rules that we're making for ourselves, but rules that might be made for the organization. So it's understood on how we communicate. Can you talk a little bit more around how you think about that rules basis for leaders in the organization and set that?
Yeah, and I've got, too, Matt, a no-cost resource on my site on exitthechaos.com, and it's called ComCheck. And the idea is we're creating a hierarchy of the communication medium. So, for example, a phone call is going to indicate that this is incredibly urgent. A text message as well. And like at the very bottom of the spectrum, we're using, maybe, email, for example, is going to be, asynchronous. It's not very urgent, but you're expecting a response typically within 24 hours or less. And so when an organization has a defined communication hierarchy, then you're able to then kind of tie back into deep work. You can then go deep into the work, as you know that if your phone isn't blowing up, then you can be able to go deep, because there's a time that a leader needs to have kind of the ear to the ground. So, I lead technology teams, and like my, phone is on, and it's actually my fourth screen. But my teams know, and we all agree to having this communication medium hierarchy agreement, so that we're not going to just, even though it's easier, send a text message. We're going to think, okay, what really is the right communication medium based on the urgency of this message? And if it's not critical and it's not urgent, we're going to use an asynchronous tool that will allow us to then batch our time. Because back into the calendar, what we ultimately want to do is on our calendar, we know that most leaders are going to need around 90 minutes of time for digital communications. And we're going to be much more effective if we're batching that time. So having 3 30-minute communication sprints on our calendar is really effective. So if everyone is aligned to these communication mediums, then we can then batch our communication time so that when we are doing our deep thinking work, that we can really be immersed and in the moment. And our team knows that if they are sending us communications, that this leader will then pick up during their next communication sprint, and the organization will continue to move forward.
Right. And I feel like we've got two diverging ideas that we're thinking about here initially. There's the idea of how we're managing the organizational time structure on what's going on, how we're thinking about it as individuals. And so maybe just following through on this organizational piece, which we're driving to. So when a leader's trying to set up how an organization utilizes their time, we said one thing that we've got in place is, hey, here's the rules of the road on the type of communication medium that you're using. What else would you suggest that leaders do to set the organization up for success in terms of how it uses time?
Yeah, another resource that I have is called Inbox Processor, and the idea of making sure that, it's really boiling down to is we want to be able to create high value work rhythms. And we want to make sure that as a leader, we're not going to be the blocker, we're going to be the enabler. And oftentimes, because there's a lack of potential discipline and also a lack of maybe time on the calendar to allocate what's needed so the team can get the answers that they need when the leader does need to collaborate, I think it's important to choose the right communication medium. So just to touch on it, Inbox 7, I think ideally leaders striving to leave the workday with 7 fewer emails in their inbox is going to allow them to communicate well. And most will go, hey, I've seen leaders with 30,000 emails in their inbox because they let it all aggregate, and it's like a big repository of communications. But if you really are relentless in unsubscribing and you have good rules in the organization, we can all be responsive to each other. So I think also having that rhythm is important, and that backs back into asking and discovering how much time as a leader do you need, Matt, for example, to be able to perform well. That's probably going to be around 90 minutes, and having that already on your calendar, and that way you're in balance. I talk about finish line planning when you're planning the next day, is you already have your communication sprints on your calendar. You can already see the meetings that you have on your calendar. Well, if you have 3 critical items that need to get done, you're asking yourself, how can I fit these in properly and still stay in balance with the meetings that I've committed to, as well as these communication sprints, so I'm not accruing all this communication debt that could be slowing my team down and causing me to be more reactive throughout the week.
Okay, great. Well, and so maybe as we drive into the individual side, so we're saying, hey, one of the things that you've got to have in place is scheduling this time to begin with. That's what makes sure it happens. How far out should you be scheduling these blocks of time? Is it something you're saying, hey, look at what your day looks like the next day and schedule them in? Or is this something you want to have on your calendar from here until eternity? How does it look for you?
Yeah, I've seen sort of a battle-tested approach is, let's take the communication sprints. And let's say that most leaders are going to need around 90 minutes a day for general email correspondence. Also, if they're using Slack or Teams, that's all digital communications. It could be also returning phone calls. So I call these communication sprints. And so a really powerful way to do this is to create three of these maybe 30-minute communication sprints on your calendar. But the important piece is you're setting them as free time, because if you start to layer in a lot of recurring items like your work sprints as well, you could be blocking your entire calendar out. So I think what's effective is that you allow your time to be flexible. Now, we did talk about these deep thinking work cycles and work sprints that should be on your calendar. Maybe you're blocking some time out, Thursday morning or Friday morning, and that's going to stay blocked out. But I recommend coming in with something like communication sprints, setting them on your calendar as recurring events that go to the future with no end date, that are set as free time, so that when you are, Matt, let's say it's Tuesday afternoon and the end of the workday, and you're getting ready to leave the workday, you're going to be planning out and allocating 15 to 20 minutes for your finish line plan for the next day. And you can already see that, okay, you've got some meetings, you've got to move around your communication sprints to fit in properly. Now you've got to layer in some time to work on, let's say, 3 critical items. And by doing that, you have now eliminated what we always hear about these this thing called the Sunday scaries, that people are, knowledge workers are in their bed Sunday evening, ruminating and dreading Monday because they don't really have a plan in place. So we can flip that script. And if we're spending time each day at the end of the workday, ideally, planning the next day, we're making sure that we're in balance. We have the right amount of communication sprints in place. We have the right amount of time to do our deep thinking work if we need to, or critical work, and we have the balance of meetings. We know that when we finish the workday, we're going to be able to have a successful day. So we're kind of winning the day to win the week, to win the month, to win the quarter, to win the year. And it really starts off with this finish line planning mindset.
Okay. Well, and so we've got a couple different parts of the calendar that you've outlined already. We've got these work sprints that we're doing. You've got, which are 90 minutes or sometimes 25, communication sprints about 30 minutes. What happens within a communication sprint? Like, what's the activity level look like? And B, is there any other categories of time that you think about within the calendar?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I would add, this, lightweight work sprints, and we have the deep thinking work sprints. And so think about anything that is kind of strategic, cognitively intense, analytical type work. That's going to be kind of more the deep thinking. And most people find that they're better off doing that work in the morning, where you can have some lightweight work sprints. So maybe, for example, you're running some reports and you're, creating some analysis from those reports. You could do that potentially in the afternoon hours. So I would add that, to the list. But you asked, Matt, like, what happens in a communication sprint? So typically what happens, let's say it's the first communication sprint. Let's say on your calendar, you've got and I would say too, you could fork those off into, we're also, running, like a family. We've got my most important job starts when, my day finishes, and now I'm with my wife and my boys. And so we also have to balance this idea of personal time. And so, you may, for example, have right out of the gates, maybe you have a 30-minute work communication sprint, and you may have followed it by maybe a 25 or 30-minute personal communication sprint. And the idea is we're leveraging the power of batching. So let's say that we're going into your first 30 minutes of a work communication sprint. The first thing you're going to do is look at all of your inboxes. For you, it may be, hey, you've got an inbox. Maybe you're using Outlook or you're using Gmail. Slack is also an inbox, or Teams is also an inbox. And you're looking at all of your inboxes for unread communications, and you're basically triaging and finding what needs to be responded to in that moment. So if I'm taking a 30-minute communication sprint, that first probably 5 to 10 minutes may be triaging. And we know that in this day and age, it may be good if a client, for example, sends an email that we can immediately acknowledge and say, hey, Betsy, I got your email and I'll be in touch later this afternoon. So they know that this urgent item is going to be identified. So we're going to take the first part of that communication sprint to triage, and then we're going to take the next to start knocking down communications that weren't quite as urgent. And if we're following that pattern throughout the day, ideally, we're going to finish the workday with 7 or fewer emails in our inbox. And that means that we've responded to those that had questions or comments, and we're being good servant leaders. We're serving our team well, and we're also not taking that sort of cognitive debt where all of a sudden our email is now up to thousands of emails, and we know that we're going to probably be pulled into a reactionary state because our digital communication is not in balance.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the type of work that you might do within these sprints. Do you think about dividing up the audiences at all in terms of how you are managing your day, how you're actually adding a time architecture to what you're doing? So there's pressure to talk to customers or pressure to talk to a board member. How do you think about that?
We make sure we need to build in flexibility to all of this. So I think a key thing I've seen high-powered executives, dive into this, but they make a mistake where they're not allocating enough buffer time. So anytime we're creating a finish line plan, first and foremost, we're creating, flexible gaps of time. So if a board member, calls us in the middle of the day and needs to talk and ends up being a 30-minute conversation, that that our finish line plan, Matt, is going to be able to absorb that time because we have large gaps of time in between, let's say, our communication sprints and our work sprints. So I think that's a really important consideration. I think also it's important to know that, kind of back to a calendar first mindset, that I would tell my board, hey, if you ever need me, here are my Calendly links. You have full permission to use my calendar, kind of back to not having an open door, but have an open calendar, schedule the time. And what's important too, I would also challenge my board, if you're going to schedule time on my calendar, because, and I tell my team is, look, I will most likely reject any meeting that comes to me that doesn't have an agenda is more than likely going to get rejected. And because it's not showing respect, I wouldn't imagine inviting someone to a meeting and not having, here's my desired meeting outcome. And there may just be a simple bullet, or it may be, hey, here's my desired meeting outcome, and here's a few agenda points. So that way I'm able to tell this team member or team members what's being expected, so they can come to the meeting prepared, and also be able to make a 60-minute meeting oftentimes be a 30-minute meeting. So I think overall the idea is, hey, asynchronous first is great if we can, have the discipline where team members also know. I think another big power move, Matt, that I learned a long time ago and bring to all of my work cultures is just the power of a 15-minute meeting. If someone needs me and it's not urgent, and they can look at my calendar and say, hey, there's some open time at 3:00, which I keep my calendar open at times so they can be able to schedule that time. But even the same day, someone could be able to schedule that time and put in a simple bullet line of, here's what I need from you. And that way, hey, I know what's coming up, and it's not coming in the form of distraction where I may have been doing this deep thinking work and now I'm pulled out from something that could be scheduled later. And so that way everyone starts to win.
One of our members, he likes to talk about the time on his calendar in terms of units, and 1 unit is 15 minutes. And, is this a 1 unit meeting? Is it a 2 unit meeting? Is it a 4 unit meeting? And how that actually works together. So I think that's a pretty interesting idea. You've mentioned the ideal recurring week model before. How does that play into what we've discussed so far?
Yeah. So John Penkoval out of Stanford did some seminal research, and it's cited a lot. It was fascinating. Is high charging, high performing leaders, that our productivity is going to start to drop at 50 hours of work. It then, interestingly, falls off a cliff at 55 hours. And his research shows there's no discernible difference between a leader that works 56 hours and one that works 70. And so backing into that, I think we need to ask the question, if I'm trying to stay rested, like Russell Foster, who's a circadian neuroscientist, says the single most important behavior as leaders is to get the right amount of sleep. Okay, so I know I need to get the right amount of sleep to bring my cognitive self, my best cognitive self, to work. I also know that I need to exercise to get at least 150 minutes of zone 1 and zone 2 minutes, so I can also understand the research behind cognitive sharpness and be able to be at my best. So I need to get that in time. I need to be able to have some family rhythms. I've got some volunteer work. I'm also, on a volunteer board. How can I balance all of that? So I have a tool, what is called the Ideal Recurring Week. And it's basically a simple application that runs inside of a Google Sheet that allows leaders to come in and go, okay, here is a typical ideal recurring week that allows me to get the right amount of sleep, the right amount of exercise. Okay. How much time do I really have for work, and how can I maximize that and do some what if scenarios? All of it rolls up into a graph and percentages, and it helps then inform how the leader can then take that intelligence and bring it into their recurring calendar and create some guardrails so they can then perform at their highest level possible.
Okay, great. So I think that idea of like, hey, all right, you got 55, more likely 50 hours that you can play with. How you're going to divide it up, that's a really important piece. Where do you see time being misused by leaders the most, where that's something that they ought to be blocking off in some way, or that they ought to be, hiving out of their schedule somehow?
Yeah, I think that if a leader isn't controlling their calendar, external forces are. So I think the most important thing is that kind of step one is having this ideal recurring week where you're visualizing and seeing your work. It's a very powerful exercise. And then you're bringing that into your calendar and you're creating these recurring events. We talked about, communication sprints, and setting that time as free and creating gaps of time so that we can absorb curveballs, and then going about 2 weeks, and then putting everything on your calendar and fleshing it out as you go. So you're kind of creating both a time and energy audit. That's a very eye-opening exercise. And I think what happens when leaders, don't do this element, because this is really about what I teach is elite level know-how. So as an elite operator, really it's all about being a little more intentional and a little more disciplined. And this is an area where if we are a little more disciplined and we want to make sure that on most work days we're planning that next day, we can be able to operate, we can exit the chaos, and we can operate calmly and deliberately and ditch all of this unneeded stress, distraction, and overwhelm. So I think the problem is, Matt, on a bumper sticker, is that a lot of leaders kind of have a calendar, they have their scheduled events, and there's not a whole lot more added to that. If we look at our calendar as our doing list, and we're saying, okay, the day before, I'm going to create a finish line plan and outline that will allow me to keep things in balance and allow me to, really ruthlessly prioritize the things that I must get done. And my brain sees that before I leave the workday. I'm going to sleep better. I'm going to come in. And really, I think, think about the focus is if you do this properly, all you have to do is come in and really you're just following your calendar. You're kind of surrendering in a way to your calendar. And you're also making sure that clearly there's going to be challenges and maybe a big situation happens where your entire afternoon gets blown to shreds. But because you stacked it and you put the more important items in the morning, at least you've gotten some of the key items done. And like Legos, you can reassemble for the next day.
Great. So as we think about, we're going to change phases in the conversation in just a moment, but in deference to that, in deep work, they talk about the idea of saying shut down complete at the end of the day. Why is that important?
Yeah, I think when we hear that, I think we all know that's a pretty good idea. And I like too how Cal Newport, he verbalizes it. He literally says out loud, shut down complete. And although I don't typically say shut down complete, there is a clear, like my finish line plan shows when my evening is done. Like today, I'm going to be playing pickleball with my youngest son at 7. That's going to be leading up to that. My shutdown complete is going to happen. So why it's important as leaders, as we need, just like we need to make sure that our team members have a work culture when they leave the workday, unless we're launching something big or there's some emergency, they can fully unplug from work, rest and restore, and bring that innovative mindset back to work, being fully recharged. And as leaders, we desperately need that same kind of a rhythm where we can have a clear finish line plan that, hey, come a certain time, depending upon that person's work cycle, that they know that their job is done. They're going to put away their device and they're going to be in the moment with their friends and family. Too often what we're doing is we're vacillating and whipsawing between personal and work, and it causes us to not be in the moment. And our spouses know it, our kids know it. And so let's flip that around and instead have some discipline, be a little more intentional, and be able to leave the workday and then be fully focused. This sort of freedom to be really in the moment is important for today's leaders.
Perfect. So with that, we'll shut down complete on the first portion of the conversation. But this was really great. We really walked the line between thinking about concepts and some tactical things that leaders can do. Just before we turn off the recording and move on to questions, where can people look up stuff on the tools that you've talked about or anything else that were referenced today?
Yeah, so anyone can go to Exit the Chaos and you're going to see a resources section. There's the ideal recurring week. It's a no cost, a mini course. If you want access, just fill out a form and you're going to get full access to that. I guarantee it will be life-changing. It's amazing too, because we're visual creatures and be able to visualize and see where our time goes and be able to make adjustments and to sort of exit the chaos and getting out of this stress, distraction, overwhelm. Also on that same resources page, there's 2 more resources, ComCheck and Inbox Processor. If you really want to add some fuel and some consistency to your team and how you work with digital communications, 2 really powerful resources. And also I put together a productivity accelerator that has 7 master classes that are all put together. If you want to sign up and apply for that, I run those usually about 3 to 4 times per year.
Excellent. Well, thanks a ton, Steve. This was great for the AFN audience to be able to absorb this. So really appreciate it.
You're welcome.